Noga, it's really great to get a chance to talk to you about this book, The Ceiling Outside, which interweaves stories of patients at the Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital, whom you visited and were able to observe under medical treatment, with the story or the account of your mother's dementia, Anne Atik, who was a great, wonderful person. I have to say, coming to the library tonight and being here talking about this book, I have this very emotional feeling where I thought all we're missing is Anne, who would normally be in the audience here. So we're honoring her with this conversation. And you have certainly honored her with this book. Let's just dive right in. What is going on here? What are you, tell us a little bit about what this book is about and what questions you set out to explore in it about the mind and the body.
Well, first of all, it's wonderful to do this. Thanks. It's great to be here. Thanks to all of you for coming. The elevator pitch of the book is how the self studies itself and how the self loses itself. So that's been my obsession from way back. And the book starts actually with that, and how I was always obsessed with consciousness and the self and how we think and who are we, all that. And I got it a few years ago. An old acquaintance, a neuroscientist and neurologist at the Pitié-Salpêtrière here in Paris, gave me the opportunity to sit in on the clinical sessions, which in very good French are called le staff of neuropsychiatry, unit of behavioral neuropsychiatry, which was set up there, and which met once a week to examine and discuss patients that presented with very ambivalent, ambiguous diagnoses. And so what happened was they met. So I started sitting in on these sessions, and they lasted all morning, which is an extraordinary luxury when you think about it. All morning, just 2 or 3 patients. So over an hour per patient. First, the discussion, the anamnesis, meaning the medical history presented by a resident, in a small room, a very small room, very intimate. I was sitting at the back anonymously, just a few people in the room. Then the patient would come in, sometimes with family, and they would be examined. And then there would be conclusions. And I was just taking notes furiously. Now, it's important to bear in mind, I only ever saw each patient once, and I didn't interact with them. And so eventually then I decided, well, I mean, I really wanted to understand what was happening to the sense of self when something went wrong. And also to understand what doctors were doing, doctors and patients and so on and so forth. And so I started writing. In the meantime, I'd become extremely interested and involved with really cutting edge work going on in experimental psychology and neuroscience on the embodied sense of self, on how the sense of self, of the brain and body are in constant interaction, this conversation, so to speak. And using those theories that I've been also writing about to try to understand what was going on with these people. That was not theories that are brought into the clinical setting, because they're, again, the cutting edge stuff isn't brought into the clinic. It's always a few steps ahead of medicine. But that's what I tried to do. So I wrote about the patients, brought in the science to try to understand them. In the meantime, I discovered that my wonderful mother, whom you knew well, was developing dementia. And so I decided, after some, soul searching, to write about that experience. So it became a kind of a first person account, where the experience of my mother helped me understand the patients, which helped me understand the science, and so on and so forth. Everything fed into each other, and it helped, and it was a kind of consolation to see that there was a way in which I could try to understand what was happening.
And it's really a kind of a poignant question. If you lose your memory, as some of these patients have done, do you lose yourself, or where does yourself begin and the memories begin or end? And a lot of the patients that you talk to, or that you didn't talk to, a lot of the patients that you observed have very strange symptoms. Why don't we just talk about some of them? Vanessa fell into a hypoglycemic coma because of undiagnosed diabetes and has terrible amnesia and basically lost 10 years of her life. Her entire life, it was as if 10 years had passed and she woke up and was, who's this person I'm married to, and what is my life, and what happened, where is my body, what is my body? I find that extremely mysterious.
Yeah, the case of Vanessa is still remains a puzzle, I think, even in my mind. I think nobody really understood what happened to her. She was a perfectly, by the way, most people who came into the room, I have to say, look, like all of us, we're all potential patients anyway. And they all looked perfectly normal until then interrogation started and you realized, oh, something's not right here. Her case, buoyant, smart, quick woman, young woman in her 30s. And turns out she'd forgotten, literally had wiped out 10 full years of her life upon waking up from that coma. And she was very overweight, and she remembered herself when she woke up as a very slim woman. She was living in the city 10 years before. There she was, married to this strange man that she did not recognize in the countryside. And there was no neurological sign, not very clear anyway, of anything really wrong with her neurologically, and her memory was fine, it was back up, so to speak. So the discussion really ended up looking as if it was a case of what used to be called, in the book I do talk a lot about the history of the notion, or what was called hysteria, which now called various things like somatoform disorder or functional disease, functional meaning as opposed to, that a functional meaning you don't see any kind of organic, as opposed to organic, you don't see any organic lesion, but you see something, there is something wrong, you just don't know what it is. And clearly it seemed like she had somatized something, some, unease, and that turned it to a kind of disease of the memory. But we don't know really what happened to her.
There wasn't a clear diagnosis.
No, there wasn't. And actually, although, I suppose she was able to reconstruct her memories as time went on. This is why she became more, let's say, she was able to lead an almost normal life, though she couldn't go back to her previous job because she couldn't remember, because she didn't want to be confronted with people asking her about her past. So that was a bit difficult for her. And she was obviously distressed about the situation. I suspect that her memories might have started to come back to her, though maybe not as her own, as would say, autonoetic. They were not her own, not as if she had lived those things, but she ended up reconstructing her life. But it's very strange because after the end of many of the sessions, and I only wrote about a very few. I mean, I saw, dozens of patients. I only wrote about 8. But after all of them, almost at the end, the doctors would say, well, you should go see a physical therapist, or you need some psychological counseling. Allez voir le kiné, the physical therapist. And I started to realize, well, actually, the kiné are the people who should have the MDs, who should be the real doctors, because it's actually through the body, for the physical therapy, that you can help people. The neurologists often had no idea what to do. And often they would send you back to the psychiatrist, who then would send you back to the neurologist. So a lot of people who have these very strange ongoings, which are called functional diseases, actually have nowhere to go medically. So that's actually something that now is being discussed a lot, but it's an important thing. I mean, like, for example, chronic pain, which affects 10% of the population. That's a functional disease. There was a patient like that in there. Geraldine.
And what did they tell her?
That she needed counseling.
She's the one who had it was her hand that had been hurt in the past, and it continued to kind of haunt her. All of these patients who are humans, people, selves, bodies, minds with families and lives, they do feel a little bit like, it is a little bit like 6 characters in search of an author, or 8 patients in search of, there's something very kind of poetic about, and suggestive about many of their backgrounds, many of their states. Tell us a little bit about Tucson, who's a Haitian patient who has acoustic hallucinations.
he was a very interesting patient precisely because, well, he came in saying that he'd been bewitched, marabouté. He was from Haiti. He was a very lovely man. I remember him very well. And he heard voices from Haiti, from his long lost friends. And he was convinced that they were trying to get at him because he'd bought a little house in the Métropole, meaning in just outside Paris. And they were envious of his success. And the doctors in the room, who were marvelous people, I have to say, extraordinary clinicians, didn't bat an eyelid. How do you say? Bat an eyelid? Do you say that? I'm sorry, I'm forgetting all my languages. And they took him at his word and had absolutely no problem completely accepting his own description of what was happening to him without a moment of hesitation. But they said to him, look, we think that what you're living is creating anxiety. We want to try to help you with your anxiety. So in entirely Western medicalized terms, he was suffering from what's called acoustic hallucinations. They were hallucinations. They were due to some kind of disorder, perhaps neurological, probably neurological. He was having very bad sleep apnea, and so it was just causing interferences in his waking life. He was having waking dreams. His quality of life was actually diminished because of this. He couldn't really stay awake. He couldn't sleep. He was not happy about what was happening to him. So he accepted to be helped. He wanted to be helped. But what was interesting in this case was that the two approaches were entirely complementary. One did not cancel the other. In other words, you could have absolutely, why not? Hallucinations have a long and very prestigious history. Hallucinations are still what helps you, in many cultures are what, you have visions, you can see the ancestors, you can see the gods, you can be in communication with a transcendent realm. Culturally speaking, there's a long history of that. And so, well, why not accept that there was an aspect to his hallucinations that corresponded to what he really perceived?
When you say acoustic hallucinations, voices as opposed to visions.
Voices, yes.
And we talked a little bit about this, the cultural determination of the diagnosis and the cultural context in which the diagnosis comes. What's the approach of this hospital? And can you tell us a little bit about that, the kind of intellectual historical framework to, maybe if he'd gone to a hospital somewhere else, they would have said, oh, voices, okay, no problem. But this was more of a neurological and a psychological approach. But
yeah, I think that certainly the quality of the medical attention in that setting, by the way, the unit does not exist anymore because they couldn't find a new psychiatrist to, that's something we can talk about. The quality of attention was extraordinary. I think it's very rare. And again, the time, the attention, the intelligence with which each patient was, the respect, deep respect with which each patient was looked at was something exemplary, and sadly very hard to find in most medical settings because of all the crises in medicine that are worldwide, I think, not just here. And yes, it's interesting that the doctors were really clearly used to just accepting the patient's description of their own history as not just in their relation to the patient, but also realizing how important the telling of your medical history by yourself is part of your own, is actually a way into the patient's, into understanding the pathology. It's in a sense, it's realizing that the pathology is putting to work this very good adage, I can't remember who said it, that a good doctor is not treating illness, but a patient, a person. So it was really the whole person they were looking at, with all the history, all the cultural context, all the conditions in which they were living, and really taking that into account a great deal. That's something that usually that happens that often, sadly. In France, there is this tradition of ethnopsychiatry. It was created actually by a Haitian, as it happens, and then taken on by somebody called Georges Devreux, who then developed it into a school. And there is still a school here of ethnopsychiatry, which is precisely try to theorize how you take on board the explanations that each culture might bring to an ailment, to understand the variety of pathologies or of states that could then be or not be called pathological.
You talk a little bit in the book. There's one passage which I will maybe read, where you say, "It occurred to me that the clinical act is one in which a person probes another selflessly, discreetly, in search of a way in, and so that medical knowledge partakes of an act of love of sorts." And then an anamnesis tells a story that is in part produced by the patient, who usually believes his or her medical narrative is coherent and whose life gives clues to its meanings. It provides a strangely intimate view of a perfect stranger, like a one-way mirror in an interrogation room. It embraces multiple perspectives, medical episodes, family histories, social circumstances, previous examinations, test results, diagnoses, divergent chronological accounts. It is a proper history, a written memory that is open to reinterpretation, for the doctors must read between its lines, taking nothing for granted, questioning like detectives.
Yeah, well, that's exactly, yeah, that's, yeah, I think those were my words, yeah.
You don't remember, do you remember writing this book, Noga? Who are you? Where are you? I feel like, Noga, in spite of your American accent, you actually grew up in France. And I feel like part of this book is a little bit like the revenge of someone who was resistant to this Cartesian education. It's not, I think, therefore I am. It's, I feel, therefore I am.
Yeah, my whole work now is really oriented towards this. And it's true that here it is still pretty much a Cartesian culture. Also, medicine is, which is why indeed this whole science this work on understanding how body and brain are really a whole, and you can't study the brain without the body, is not yet really taken into account, and why the doctors are just shoving patients to the body doctors because they themselves don't know quite what to do. And it's not as if those particular kinds of treatments, those more, let's say, was vulgarly called holistic treatments, are not actually part of mainstream medicine, which is a shame, actually. I think maybe they should be.
But some of these patients have psychological disorders and like psychoses or different complexes. Can you just back us up for a minute and talk a little bit about the line between neurology and psychiatry, and where is that line?
Yeah, it's true. I think it's unclear for most people. It's a line that came into view in the early 20th century. Basically, neurology, at least still is, concerned with those, again, not functional, the organic lesions in the brain, visible. Something's wrong, like a stroke or like dementia. That's clearly neurological. Psychiatric ailments are not connected to any kind of organic lesion that you can see, that you can individuate. There's now confusion in a way between, and many people are now arguing that there's no point anymore in separating neurology and psychiatry, which is, by the way, why this unit came together in the first place. Because, well, for one thing, obviously our knowledge of the brain has, progressed hugely over the past century, but also because we have increasingly refined imaging technologies, so that what we can see more and more things that we weren't able to see. Also, it's obvious that if something is wrong with you, with your mind, it's not wrong with anything outside you. It's wrong. Something's wrong inside you. There's a biological basis for everything, including for Vanessa. We just don't know where. We don't know how to locate what's going on, and that may be the difference. Neurology is you can still locate. You can locate the problem. You can see it. You can see the neurons. In the case of Alzheimer's, you can see the neurons that are dying, and that's a crucial difference. But it's becoming counterproductive in a way to maintain this difference. The last degree in neuropsychiatry, I think, was delivered in France in the 70s. And that was that. And so now the different trainings. And so psychiatrists are closer to psychoanalysis, whereas neurologists are closer to the medical profession. But this is where you need the two to come together. There is a discipline of neuropsychoanalysis, which was created by Mark Solms, a South African, some decades ago, but it hasn't really taken off for reasons that are probably internal to the disciplinary structures of these professions.
And while you're sitting in on these sessions and observing these patients, this coincides with your mom's dementia and her becoming increasingly disoriented. She's a poet, and your father was a painter. Set the scene for us, Arikha, childhood, family, growing up. Tell us a little bit about your parents, and then we'll talk a little bit about your mom.
I could read maybe about my mom. Yes, so should I just go ahead and just read? Yeah, I'll do that. It's from the very beginning. About what's happening to my mom. She died almost exactly, like just over 2 years ago. 26th of February was 2 years. And there are people in this room who were also very close to her. So it's a good moment indeed to have her around us. She was extremely funny. Was born in Jerusalem, 8th generation, religious family, then grew up in New York, freed herself of the religious fold, became a poet. And because she was a poet and an intellectual, and my father was a painter, was a very intensely creative and intellectual household, because of that, she had what doctors called a lot of cognitive reserve, which means that during her dementia, she was blessed with a very rich verbal fluency, which never diminished really, and her the semantic fluency was intact, and her importantly, her affect, her emotional self was intact. So the illness did not really touch her emotional self, and she recognized it till the end to the very end, which is very, very lucky. I have to say also that it doesn't. I know it's not the case for all dementias, but in her case, and she's not the only one in that either. She was extremely happy. She'd always been very anxious, like just tons of Jewish anxiety all the time, like really anxious. And the Alzheimer's rid her of all that. She suddenly became happy, almost like living in kind of yogic contemplation of the present. Everybody was beautiful. And everything was wonderful. And she was hilarious. She'd always been funny, but she became even funnier. So at some level, it was hard for us, of course. And I can read also a passage about what it meant for us. But on it goes. It's not, all rosy. Memory chopped up into incoherent bits. Sentences that don't stick together while the syntax is perfect. Past, present, future, all neatly separated. But what goes into which? No longer. All is mixed up. Names, children and grandchildren, episodes, sounds. Familiarity disintegrating. Stories untold and transposed from one place, one face to another. Coherence and incoherence coexisting, akin to the sane and the mad rubbing shoulders over drinks at a cocktail party. The happy hour, the 11th hour, the evening of existence almost spent, while joy overtakes melancholy and a strange calm replaces anxiety. She frets less, laughs more, enjoys life and feels young and alive. Her jokes are funnier than ever, their associations free and wild. Her sayings are somehow sensical, and they can be double-edged. Just have fun, just have fun, they said with tears in their eyes, was one of them. Her memory is shunting her from place to place as if she were ice skating blindfolded, while the only way for us to remain in our place is not to follow her, to ignore, to let go, let her go, let it be, let it unfold, and occasionally take notes. We can only be good daughters by not being the daughters we once were. We take it in. We must laugh. She is not sad. We cannot be sad either. the ceiling inside, the ceiling outside, she said the other day, sing-song and amused.
It's really beautiful. I think that for me, the most beautiful parts of the book are grappling with what's happening with your mother, and the parts about the patients I learned a lot from. But it's clear that, you know, the emotional connection is with your mom, who I before I came, Noga, I was looking at her 2001 book, How It Was, which is a memoir about Beckett, Samuel Beckett, who was a close friend of your parents, a very close friend. And Noga, that book begins: after 15 years of memorable conversations with Beckett, I realized that I could not depend on my memory. The unforgettable was becoming the irretrievable. It would have broken our friendship if I had taken notes in his presence. And then she goes on to talk about that. And I read that and it was kind of took my breath away.
Yeah, thank you. I remember the big opening of the book, and indeed, yes, I hadn't thought about it. Thank you. Yeah, I don't know what she'd make of this. I did tell her once, Mom, I'm writing about you. Oh, really? She said.
Well, when you talk about these patients who have different memory disorders and can't remember things, and also your mom, you know, there is, I have to just say, there is something looming over this book, over both of your parents and your family, which is the memory of the Holocaust, which is a gigantic thing. And whenever we think about memory, whether it's neurological or whatever, it's also kind of world historical and familial too.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know what to say about this, honestly. I mean, definitely we know that memory, that trauma is passed on. So it's there. We don't really know how it works. Theories about epigenetics can help us maybe understand, you know, what's going on, how it gets transmitted, what gets transmitted, how. Bodily transmission, it's definitely, again, embodied memory. All memory is embodied. In the case of, well, my mother was not, my father was the Holocaust survivor. He was in the camps for 3 years in Transnistria, which was in the Ukraine.
Moldova.
In Moldova, yeah, Moldova, yeah. So that was definitely an important part of our childhood. And it's true that looking at somebody of somebody's memory, you wonder what's left. It's true when somebody's narrative memory, which is the case of what happened to my mom, her narrative memory went to bits. She didn't remember anything anymore. She did just remember nothing of her past. And even that went away. Everything went away. So it's true that it's very strange to be, the relationship changed, the relationship with my mother, with all the shared memories, including the shared memory of that big thing, no longer there. It's a very disturbing, and it's very hard to know how to cope with this. I think it's what a lot of the families of people with dementia feel, that because shared memories, shared collective memory as well, shared culture memory, whether it's history, personal history, or literature or anything, but it just goes away. And so you wonder what's left, but something was left of her. And I think what was left really was what one calls, or what the neuroscientist Antonio Damasio talks about the minimal self, or the core self, which is the self we're born as, the body we're born as, and that we die as, that never goes away. She did not know that this was happening to her, right? So this is the other blessing of this kind of dementia, which is the condition of what was known as anosognosia, where the lack of knowledge of your own illness, which helps the patient, you know, because the patient doesn't know they're a patient. It can be disturbing in other situations, in severe psychiatric conditions, where the patient, for example, in schizophrenia, don't know that they're ill and don't take their medication, so their condition worsens. And then there's strange conditions like the ones described a lot by Oliver Sacks and studied also by all these people I now work with in in psychology. And for example, anosognosia for hemiplegia, there's conditions where a patient might not know that their other hand is theirs, and yet will or will not be able to grab something with their hand. All these things. Or there was another patient here who had who had multiple personality disorder, who didn't realize that his difficulty in moving his limbs unprompted was connected to his having this split personality. So that was another example of where the self is deeply embodied and manifests in your own sense of body, your sense of being the owner of your own body, and body ownership, which is also studied and is also something that the brain is processing in response to stimuli from the body and back. So all these things are being studied, and then you see them happening and realize, wow, what can we do to help? And then, well, the doctors say, just go see the kiné.
To move around. This book is full. I very much improved my Greek and Latin vocabulary reading this. We have anagnosia, which is not to be aware of your, of your illness. Also, I hadn't ever thought that delirium comes from lyra being a straight line. Delirium, it means kind of veering from a straight path. I found this, I took some poetic notes on this. Also, you talk about allostasis, which are the adjustments that we make to kind of keep homeostasis, to keep our basic balance. And so many of these patients are, they're kind of off. They haven't achieved that.
Well, no, they have. It's just that it's kind of gone off. I mean, homeostasis is the process by which we're able to maintain a internal stability in relation to a constantly changing world. And
let me know when you find out how to do that.
Well, as we do it all the time. If you weren't, you would be dead. It's like, what prompts you to actually, that's what enables you to, when you're thirsty, you need to drink, right? So that's part of it. The homeostasis is what enables you to keep your body temperature constant, even while the external temperature is changing. And so all these, this is a crucial, but it was interesting was to see that these patients, at least in my interpretation, which is debatable, really, could be debatable, really had these processes, including the processes to which homeostasis to corresponds, is interoception, which is what I've written about and I'm interested in the study of which I'm interested, which is the sense of the body from inside. So all the signals that happen from within the body that are processed in the brain that enable us then to be constantly living in the world, interacting with each other, having a sense of time, appetite, having shared time, and also having regulated emotions. So when all this, something goes askew, like the sense of time, which also goes askew in dementia, or in depression for that matter, or any of these kinds of disorders, they are disorders, then this is when interoceptive processes are actually disrupted. So something's gone wrong. But we're only the beginning of understanding how this works. It's still pretty mysterious, really.
You talk also about Rebos Law, is that how you pronounce his name? That where the stronger the memory, the farther away from the onset of the amnesia. So you say the progressive destruction of memory follows a logical order, a law. It advances progressively from the unstable to the stable. The most recent memories have fewer associations. The older ones are more visceral and sensorial.
Yeah, that's Théodule Ribot. Théodule Ribot was one of the people who really created scientific psychology in the 19th century and was a very prolific writer and psychologist. I have to say I haven't read all that much about of him, but so there were, and William James was the counterpart, of course, in America, who was crucially important for scientific psychology. But Ribot, there was this Rebos Law, what all neurologists know as Rebos Law, and what was strange in Vanessa's case, that the Rebos Law didn't apply because she had just lost a chunk of 10 years, which is why they didn't believe it was organic amnesia, but functional amnesia, meaning it wasn't something neurologically wrong with her, but that somehow she'd chosen to repress 10 years of her life. There is debate as to whether Rebos Law really holds or not. I mean, it's 100 years old, and there's been revisions to lots of memory, theories about memory has changed a little bit. Again, huge, vast area of research, fascinating stuff.
Can you read us a little from page 97, which is a kind of a funny part about your mom?
Oh, yes. when faced with this unwinding of a person one is close to, one can only observe, accept the ride, be present, help, and seek help, and laugh too. My mother luckily does not have the signs of LBD, which is another dementia, Lewy body dementia, which is pretty terrible and includes hallucinations. She has no hallucinations, for instance. We are only conjecturing that she has Alzheimer's disease since we have decided not to test for its biomarkers. It makes little sense to subject her to an invasive lumbar puncture, given how little one can do to help in any case. And given that whatever it is she has, it's making her serene. It's as if this particular proteinopathy, to call it that, one of the neurologists in the room had suggested one day that we should call all dementias proteinopathies, because they're really, something's wrong with the proteins that make up the neurons in all cases. There was this particular proteinopathy, to call it that, we're bringing out the most life-loving, giving, affectionate, exuberant, humorous, and gracious aspects of her personality, enhancing it. In this sense, her anosognosia is a blessing. Her relation to people is still emotionally full. It's just devoid of coherent references. And the verbal exchanges that have replaced conversation have become surreal, hilariously so sometimes. It helps that they are peppered with those one-liners I write down. Where are the children? I asked the other day when we all visited her, and suddenly they could be neither seen nor heard from the living room where we were sitting. They're being brainwashed, she responded, and then laughed. I still say it now when asked where the children, I say where they're being brainwashed, but it's probably true. They're playing Minecraft all day long. She knows who she is still, and she knows who I am. She still tells me how to wear my unruly curly hair, and when she does, it's as if nothing had changed. As long as she can criticize my hair, the mother in you still exists. The mother who many years ago laughed heartily with me and shared self-recognition at a New Yorker cartoon in which a mother and daughter are browsing in a bookstore. And while the mother looks at the biography section, the daughter, standing at the nearby criticism section, tells her, "Look, mother, this section should interest you." The hair moments are little specks of light within her growing penumbra, but she no longer gets the cartoon. The unraveling goes on. She's disoriented in time and space, unable to hold on to facts. Dysexecutive syndrome in full play. I explain elsewhere what a dysexecutive syndrome is. It's when the executive function of the brain, which is the planning, most rational, so to speak, aspect of brain, frontal cortex, goes amiss. She does not know where she is within her embodied temporality, which explains why she depends on her carers to attend to her personal hygiene. Her internal schedule is off kilter. She awakes in the middle of the night, believing it is morning. Her circadian clock, an embodied sense of time, as distorted as the haunting clocks in those Dali paintings that used to terrify me when I was small. Circadian disturbances are typical of many dementias, not just LBD, Lewy body, which is why, when, as I reordered my wardrobe to meet the spring, I found a top that she had bought for me a few years ago. It occurred to me that I will never receive another gift from her. She can no longer go shopping and can't remember she ever did. She cannot grasp where she is in the space and time of the world, of her life, of her memories, of others. And it is not just cartoons we no longer can laugh at together. She also no longer remembers what she likes. I can no longer share articles and books with her, nor show her my work as I always used to, and as I did one last time on that last Eurostar ride, which you will have forgotten by now. The news of the historic COVID-19 pandemic, during which I write these lines, somewhat pierces through to her awareness, but not quite. "Mommy, half the planet is confined." "Well, they won't confine me," she said. My younger son says memory is a labyrinth in which she has got lost. References are diminishing fast. The humorous wordplay cannot hide that the world has become, from her perspective, a place of chaos. It may even reveal the chaos. "I can't see the letters, but I saw the words." I can't see the letters, but I saw the words, she quipped recently. The verbal agility sometimes translates into an unconscious awareness. "I'm so okay, I can't stand it." very fun. I don't know what the world looks like for her. Then I refer to other things. So, yeah, she's rarely hungry and forgets to drink. Her interoceptive signaling as off kilter as her inner clock. All dementias ultimately distort agency, the engrammed self, the body in the world, the time in this world.
Thank you. I think before we open it up for questions, can I just ask you one thing about, writing a book, one begins as one person and kind of ends or finishes and emerges as a slightly different person. And I wonder if you have any reflections on the process of writing this and where it kind of took you in your thoughts and in your intellectual and kind of emotional trajectory. How did it change you?
Well, at first it was cathartic. It certainly helped. As I said before, it was consoling. And science for me is consoling. And I was actually write also one page about my dad, who, when he died of cancer 12, almost 13 years ago now, he was so interested in medicine that he was really interested in his own case. And we were sharing lots of information about his case. And it was consoling. And that, I think, is important. These scientists actually really do inspire me. Those ones who are aware also of the human dimension of what they're doing. And so, yes, writing it certainly helped me understand, go forward, how we can. I mean, that's why I call myself now a science humanist, how we can really try to put science and humanities together in a way that is meaningful. Understand where meaning is when you are explaining something scientifically. Keep the human meaning there. And now I'm writing a book on anthropology, so I'm also interested in how psychology becomes anthropology and how, indeed, culture and biology interact. That's something I find super interesting. But writing the book, yes, it made me feel as if, yes, I'd gotten past a certain point where I can continue looking at the science. And then, yes, but then also I don't know what my mother would make of this.
You'll have to live with the uncertainty, I'm afraid. Okay, maybe we can take some questions from the audience now.
Thank you both for such a really remarkable conversation. That was just wonderful. And I have lots of questions, but I'm sure everyone else in the audience does too. So we'll start with our in-person audience. Raise your hands now, and please don't be shy. We have lots of time. Yes.
As somebody who spent so much of your life, professional career, thinking about the notion of self, watching your mother lose those memories, lose her anchoring in time and space. Obviously, you're not in her head, but do you have the sense that her sense of herself changed? And did your sense of herself change?
That's a great question. Yes, is the short answer. She knew, I mean, as she was sliding into that condition, I mean, she was always quite confusing because she was a pure poet and not at all ever a practical person. So the confusion, it was very hard to see when it started, because actually it just became increasingly confused. And we were always, by the way, I have to say, both my sister and I were always irritated with her about her confusion. And suddenly we had to stop being irritated with her because we realized actually it's shifted into pathology. And when you realize it's pathology, then you have to, let go and stop yelling at your mom. But she, there was that transition. She definitely knew something was not quite right. And she would get angry. We tried to help her. It's crazy, she'd say. And I think that's something that happens to a lot of people with dementia, sadly. It's a very difficult moment. But look, the thing, sense of stuff is a constant dynamic construction. It sounds as if it's a process, like everything, basically. I think it helps to think of everything as process, not thing. There are no things, only processes. Self is the same, is also like that. And it's also made of multiple dimensions. So again, her affective self, her emotional self did not change at all. Her embodied self didn't, and I write about it. I mean, I could have read that passage to her. The touch of her hand on my cheek did not change. That basic relation from mother to child did not change, which is a I think, and most people, again, who have dementia in their families have that experience, which is the one thing you can hold on to. What changed was cognition, shared memory, all that, which constitutes the self as well. Right? As I said, the narrative self, not the embodied affective self. The different dimensions, they interconnect. We always take them for granted as one thing. And this is when you realize that one disappears, you realize, oh my God, I was taking for granted that this is one thing. Actually not. We are made of multiple pieces that are constantly in interaction, dynamic interaction, co-constructing each other. And then when one piece goes, you realize, oh, okay, what do we do with this rest of the edifice? And so, and since all, the self is also relational, there's no self, it's not like we're multiple monads isolated from each other, as Descartes thought. We are relational. And so, especially the mother and child, obviously, the first other that the child defines itself, how the self forms itself in relation to the first other is the mother. And so that's it's a profound disruption when this happens. It's a profound crisis when your own mother is no longer the one that you knew. But there's, again, something that remains. But again, we are all in interaction with each other always. So obviously when part of her when that narrative, cognitive dimension went, so did some part of me go at some level. At some level, something doesn't happen. You start interrogating things, and then you build yourself back up. But and you have to adapt constantly. And I think any person who has, again, dementia in the family, they know that. I think it's a constant adaptation to a process whose end is obviously one.
Other questions? Yep.
Noga, you said that your mother didn't lose her emotional feelings, we could say. Could she say, I love you?
Oh, all the time.
Okay. And you also said that she was very appreciative. Everything was beautiful. So she was feeling, as you said, happy and serene. And so it was just a really simple question. Did she say, I love you? And you said yes.
Yeah.
And she loved your kids, and she recognized you into the end, which is amazing.
Yeah, she was full of love. She was almost pure love. It was quite extraordinary. I think, yeah, it was.
Other questions in the room? Yes.
Following up a little bit on what was just said, my mother was a stroke victim, but she did not have Alzheimer's. She recognized me. I could show her a baby picture. She said, that's you. The memories that she could express were pretty intact. And her personality also changed for the better. She was warmer and less critical, a little less critical. So I was just wondering if the scientists have paid attention to this emotional element of people whose minds are affected.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of work on that too. It sounds like she was lucky in some way. The stroke is unfortunate, and it's difficult.
My brother was also a stroke victim. He's not my mother's child, and his personality has not changed.
Yeah, it really does depend in this case. This is straightforward neurology. It's a question of, in the sense that it's certain parts of the brain it depends on the parts of the brain that are affected, that will have a different fallout, a different consequence. That's the whole point. Which part of the brain did the stroke take place in? This is where localization is still real. It's not as if it's entirely, obviously it is. So that's what will make the difference at some level. So yeah, that's Well, it's not as a formal discipline that delivers diplomas, but obviously people are trying to put the two together. I mean, look, even in dementia, I mean, the dementia can be announced by depression, and there are some people who are still asking, does the depression actually eventually cause it, or is it actually just a first symptom? So this is one of the questions. For example, we don't really know these things yet. So this is where you realize that psychiatry and neurology really are obviously necessary for each other. And then the people then who do have some neurological ailments that will then produce psychiatric ones, like psychotic, like some of the patients have that. They have some or even Parkinson's that may produce some other psychiatric issues that will require psychiatric care. Does you realize that really are joint, in a sense, comorbidities, as they call them, with an awful word. But this is where it's a very complex, obviously. The brain, as we know, it's pretty complex. So we don't really know half the story. I mean, there's a lot of work is ongoing and to try to understand these things. Stroke is I mean, again, this is where you have a visible lesion that will entrain particular problems. And yeah.
Other questions? Yes.
Thank you so much for this conversation. It's so fascinating and really moving as well. So that's wonderful. Since I've heard the adjective poetic come up quite a bit, and the excerpts that you read are very poetic and stylistically worked through. So I guess I wanted to hear you speak more about being a humanist and a scientist, and how much the work of style and the poetic word is so essential to describing a neurological, psychological condition, that to get at what one is trying to describe, a particular style, a lyrical or poetic style, has to evolve.
Thank you. Yeah, that's the crux of it for me, actually. I never became a real academic because I don't like academics non-style. I think style is profoundly important. It's actually the substance of expression, any expression. And yeah, in that sense, I'm also very much my parents' daughter. There's no escaping that. Firmly, very, very formatted to believe that artistic expression really is the point. But what does that mean? That rejoins also the issue. I mean, what was coming from the very beginning of my was always interested in me is how the question that's shared by many philosophers. How can the object of your study, how can the subject and the object of study be the same, meaning the brain? How can we do this, right? The study of consciousness is constantly hitting itself, so to speak, against that particular issue. How do you use the first person studying the third person, and it's the same person? How do we do this? And that's the problem. So a lot of philosophy of mind is unbelievably dry and boring, because ultimately it's like this, a snake biting its tail. So I got out of the philosophy thing, then ended up doing history of ideas, because I thought we have to get a conceptual, the historical context to the concepts we are looking at here, and where these ideas come from. But ultimately, in the writing, I realized it is a return to France and Merleau-Ponty. We have a great specialist of Merleau-Ponty in the room, of subjectivity being the matter of it, and that you actually take it seriously. For a while in the history of science and history of psychology, and especially with the development from behaviorism in the 50s and the development of computational neuroscience, you couldn't really talk about the self experience, the first person emotional experience, subjective experience, as something that science should study. That changed. 19th century with William James and Wundt and Ribot and those people, yes, you could. But then there was this interim where in the early 20th century, first half of the 20th century, up until quite recently, actually, you really couldn't do it. Then over the past few decades, it's been with a revival, actually, of Merleau-Ponty and phenomenology, meaning really taking on board the first person to understand how we are, like all experience, and first person in relation to others. Again, the self other being the key that we're looking at. Then we had this. Now, then a lot of even neuroscience and psychology took on board that philosophical tradition, and in a sense reignited the approaches, late 19th century approaches to psychology that have become very, actually very actual, come back and alive again. And I think a lot of the most interesting work, the stuff I'm interested in interoception and so on, really comes out of that particular school of thought. And I realized when I was writing, I'm also kind of impatient by people talking about phenomenology. I realized I was enacting it by just writing my experience. You enact phenomenology. You don't need to talk about it anymore. We know what it is. Enact it. Do it. Just do it. And that's what this, in a way out, if you like, of that conundrum of object subject, I realize is that. And that's what art is also, ultimately. So I try to put it together in that way. And then the science humanist thing, that's a kind of broader mission, I think I'm trying to sort of develop, really, of trying to really there's still so many silos within academic disciplines, and not just academic, professional as well. And even between neurologists and psychiatrists, let alone neuroscientists and neurologists who don't talk to each other. And then between the humanities and history and philosophy and so on, we need to try to get rid of these silos, to really try to put that together. And because humanities are necessary for scientists also to ask the right questions, just as science is necessary for humanists to actually get to realize that there are definitely some data we can look at. We need to understand how things work, and we need to ask the questions about how we understand how things work. So this is basically what I'm interested in doing.